Hi Mark, this is Michael. My student number is S0141007. The speech title is The Emergent Genius of Ant Colonies, and I'm the senior student at NCUE. So I'm going to read the TED Talk speech. The Emergent Genius of Ant Colonies by Deborah Gordon. I study ants, and that's because I like to think about how organization works, and in particular how the simple parts of organizations interact to create the behavior of the whole organization. So, ant colonies are a good example of an organization like that, and there are many others. The web is one. There are many biological systems like that. Brain cells developing embryos. There are about 10,000 species of ants. They all live in colonies consisting of one or few queens. And then all the ants you see walking around are sterile female workers. And all ant colonies have in common that there's no central control. Nobody tells everybody what to do. The queen just lays the egg. There is no management. No ants direct the behavior of any other ant. And I try to figure out how that works. And I have been working for the past 20 years on the population of sea-eating ants in southeastern Arizona. Here's my study site. This is really a picture of ant, and the rabbits just happen to be there. And these ants are called harvester ants because they eat seeds. This is the nest of the mature colony, and there's a nest entrance. And they forage maybe for about 20 meters away, gather up the seeds and bring them back to the nest and store them. Every year I go there and make a map of my study sites. This is just a road, and it's not very big. It's about 25 meters on one side, 400 on the other, and every colony has a name, which has number, which is painted on the rock. And I go there every year and look for all the colonies that were alive the year before, and figure out which one have died and put all the new ones in on the map. And by doing this, I know how old they are all. And because of that, I've been able to study how their behavior change and as the colony gets older and larger. So I want to tell you about the life cycle about a colony. So ants never make more ants. Colonies make more colonies. And they do that by each year sending out the reproductive. So those are the ones with wings on the mating flight. So every year on the same day, and it's a mystery exactly how this happens. Each colony sends out a virgin unmated queens with wings and the males, and they all fly to a common place and they mate. And this shows us recently virgin queens. Here's her wings, and she's in the process of mating with this male. And there's another male on the top waiting his turn. Often the queens mate more than once. And after that the males all dies. That is for them after. And then the newly made queen fly off somewhere, drop their wings, dig a hole, and go into that hole and start laying eggs. And they will live for 15 or 20 years, continue to lay eggs using the sperm from that original made egg. So the queen goes down in there. She lays eggs, she feeds the larvae, so ants started eggs and egg. Then there's a larva. She feeds the larvae by regurgitating from her fat reserve. Then as soon as the first group of ants emerge, their larvae, then they pupae, then they come out as adult ants. They go out, they get food, they dig the next, and the queen never comes out again. So this is a 1-year-old colony. This happened to be 536. There's a nest entrance. There's a pencil for scales. So this is the colony founded by a queen the previous summer. This is a 3 years old colony. There's a nest entrance. There is a pencil for scales. They make a pile of refuse, mostly the husk of the seeds that they eat. This is a 5-year-old colony. This is a nest entrance. Here's a pencil for scales. This is about as big as they get, about a meter across. And then this is how colony size and the number of workers and changes. So this is about 10,000 workers ants. Changes as a function of colony age in years. So it started out with 0 ants, just the founding queen, and it grows out to a size of about 10 or 12,000 ants when the colony is 5. And it says that size until the queen dies and there is nobody to make more ants when she is about 15 or 20 years old. And it's when they reach this stable size in numbers of ants that they start to reproduce. That is to send more winged queen and male to get to that year's mating flights. And I know how colony size changes as a function of colony age, because I've dug out colonies of known age and counted all the ants. Laughter. So that's not the most fun part of this research, although it's interesting. Laughter. So really the question that I think about with these ants is what I call task allocation. That's not just how is the colony organized, but how does it change what it's doing? How does it that the colony manage to adjust to the number of workers performing each task as conditions change? So things happen to an ant colony. When it's rain in the summer, it flows in the desert. There's a lot of damage on the nest, and extra ants are needed to clean up that mess when extra food becomes available. And this is what everybody knows about picnic. Then extra ants are allocated to collect the food. So with nobody telling anybody what to do, how is it that the colony managed to adjust the number of workers performing each task? And that's the process that I call task allocation. And in harvest ants, I divide the task of the ant I see just outside the nest into these 4 categories, where an ant is foraging when it's out along the foraging trail, searching for food or bringing food back. The patrollers, that's supposed to be a magnifying glass, are an interesting group that go out early in the morning before the foragers are active. They somehow choose the direction that the foragers will go, and by coming back, just by making it back, they tell the forager that it's safe to go out. Then the next maintenance workers work inside the nest. And I want to say that the nest look a lot like Bill Leishman's house. That is, that there are chambers inside. They line the walls of the chambers with mold, soil, and it's dry to a kind of adobe-like surface in it. It also looks very similar to some of the cave dwelling of the Hopi people that are in that area. And the nest maintenance workers do that inside the nest, and then come out of the nest carrying bits of dry soil in their mandibles. So you see the nest maintenance worker come out with a bit of sand, put it down, turn around, and go back in. And finally, the middle workers put some kinds of territorial chemicals in the garbage. So what you see the middle workers doing is making a pile of refuse. On one day it's all here, and on the next day they move it over there and then move it back. So that's what the middle workers do. And this fourth group are just the ants outside the nest. So that's only about 25% of the colonies, and they are the oldest ants. So an ant start out somewhere near the queen, and when we dig up the nest, we find that they are about as deep as the colony is wide. So about a meter deep for the big old nest. And then there's another long tunnel and a chamber where we often find a queen after 8 hours of hacking away at a rock with pickaxes. I don't think that chamber has evolved because of me and my backhoe and my crew of students with pickaxe, but instead because when there's a flooding, occasionally the colony has to go down deep. So there's a whole network of chambers. The queen's in there somewhere. She just lay eggs. There's a larvae, and they consume most of the food. And this is true of most ants. That the ants you see walking around don't do much eating. They bring it back and feed it to the larvae. When the forage comes in with food, they just drop it into the upper chamber. And other ants come up from the below, get the food, bring it back, house the seed, and pile them up. There are nest maintenance workers working throughout the nest. And curiously and interestingly, it looks as though at any time, about half the ants in the colony are just doing nothing. So despite what it says in the Bible about, look the ant, those slugger, in fact, you could think of those ants as reserved. That is to say, if something happened, and I've never seen anything like this happen, but I've only been looking for 20 years. If something happens, they might all come out if they were needed, but in fact, mostly they're just hanging around, and I think it's a very interesting question. What is there about the way the colony is organized that might give some function to the reserve of ants who are doing nothing? And they're sort of stand as a buffer in between the ants working deep inside the nest and the ants working outside. And if you mark ants that are working outside and dig up a colony, you'll never see them dig down. So what's happening is that the ants work inside the nest when they're younger. They somehow get into this reserve, and then eventually they get recruited to join this exterior workforce. And once they belong to the ants that work outside, they will never go back down. Now, most ants, including these, don't see very well. They have eyes. They can distinguish between light and dark, but they mostly work by smell. So just to reinforce what you might have thought about, an ant queen isn't true. Even if the queen did have the intelligence to send chemical message through this whole network of chambers to tell the ants outside what to do, there is no way that such message could make it in time to see. The shifts in the allocation of workers that we actually see outside the nest. So that's one way that we know the queen isn't directing the behavior of the colony. So when I first set out to work on task allocation, my first question was, what's the relationship between the ants doing different tasks? Does it matter to the forager what the nest maintenance workers are doing? Does it matter to the middle workers what the patrollers are doing? And I was working in the context of a view of ant colonies in which each ant was somehow dedicated to its tasks from birth, and sort of perform independently of the others, knowing its place on the assembly line. And instead I want to ask, how are different task groups interdependent? So I did experiment where I changed one thing. So for example, I create more workers for the next maintenance workers by putting out a pile of toothpicks near the nest entrance early in the morning when the nest maintenance workers are first active. This is what it looks like about 20 minutes later. Here's about 40 minutes later, and the next maintenance worker just take all the toothpicks to the outer edge of the nest mound and leave them there. And what I wanted to know was that, okay, here's a situation where extra next maintenance workers were recruited. Is this going to have any effect on the workers performing other tasks? Then we repeat all these experiments with the ants marks. So here's some blue nest maintenance workers. And lately we got more sophisticated, and we have this 3-color system. And we can mark individually so we know which ant is which. And we started out with model airplane paint, and then we found these wonderful little Japanese markers, and they work really well. And so just to summarize the result, well, it turns out that yes, the different tasks are interdependent. So if I change the number performing one task, it changed the number of performing others. So for example, if I make a mess that the next maintenance worker have to clean up, then I see fewer ants out foraging, and this was true for all the pairwise combination of tasks. And the second result, which was surprising to a lot of people, was the ant actually switched tasks. The same ant doesn't do the same tasks over and over its whole life. So for example, if I put out extra food, everybody else, the middle workers stop doing middle food, go get the food, they become foragers, the next maintenance worker become foragers, the patroller become foragers. But not every transition is possible, and this shows how this works. Like I just said, if there is more food to collect, the patroller, the middle workers, the next maintenance workers will all change to forage. If there is more patrolling to do, so I create a disturbance. So extra patroller were needed, the next maintenance worker will switch to patrol. But if more next maintenance worker is needed, for example, if I put out a bunch of toothpicks, then nobody will ever switch back to nest maintenance. They have to get nest maintenance workers from inside the nest, so foraging acts as a sink, and the ants inside the nest as like a source. And finally, it looks like each ant is decided moment to moment whether to be active or not. So for example, when there is extra nest maintenance worker to do, it's not that the foragers switch over. I know that they don't do that, but the foragers somehow decide not to come out. And here was the most intriguing result. The task allocation. This process changed with colony age, and it changed like this. When I do this experiment with our older colonies, so ones that are 5 years or older, they're much more consistent for one time to another. They are much more homeostatic. The worse things get, the more I hassle them, the more they act like undisturbed colonies. Whereas the young small colonies, the 2 years old colonies of just 2,000 ants are much more variable. And the amazing thing about this is that ants live only a year. It could be this year or this year. So the ants in the older colonies that seem to be more stable are not any older than the ants in the younger colony. It's not due to the experience of older, wiser ants. Instead, something about the organization must be changing as a colony gets older, and it obviously thinks that changing is its size. So since I have had this result, I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what kind of decision rules, very simple, local, probably olfactory, chemical rules could be using, since no ants can access to since no ants can assess the global situation, that will have the outcome that I see. This predictable dynamic in who does what task, and it will change as the colony gets larger. And what I have found out is that ants are using a network of antennal contacts. So anybody who's ever looked at ants has seen them touch antennae. The smell is their antennae. When one ant touches another, it's smelling it, and it can tell, for example, whether the other ant is a nestmate. Because ants covering themselves in each other through grooming with a layer of grease which carry a colony's specific odor. And what we are learning is that an ant uses the pattern of its antennal contacts, the rate at which it meets ants of other tasks in deciding what to do. And so what the message is not any message that they transmit from one ant to another, but the pattern. The pattern itself is the message, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But first you might be wondering, how is it that an ant can tell, for example, I'm the forager? I expected to meet another forager every so often, but if instead I start to meet a higher number of nest maintenance workers, I'm less likely to forage. So it has to know the differences between the forager and the nest maintenance worker. And we have learned that in this species, and I suspect in others as well, these hydrocarbons is the layer of grease on the outside of ants is different as ants perform different tasks, and we've done experiments that show that because the longer an ant stayed outside, the more these simple hydrocarbons on its surface change, and so they come to smell different by doing different tasks, and they can use that task specific odor in particular hydrocarbon. They can use that in their brief internal contact to somehow keep track of the rate at which they are meeting ends of certain tasks. And we've just recently demonstrated this by putting extra of hydrocarbons on little glass bread beads and dropping the beads gently down into the nest entrance at the right rate. And it turns out the ant will respond to the right rate of contact with a glass bead with hydrocarbon extract on it, as they were to contact with real ants. So I want now to show you a bit of film, and this will start out first of all showing you the nest entrance. So the idea is that ants are coming in and out of the nest entrance. They've gone out to do different tasks, and the rate at which they meet as they come in and out of the nest entrance determines or influence each ant's decision about whether to go out and which task to perform. This is taken through a fiber optics microscope is down inside the nest. In the beginning you see the ants just kind of engaging with the fiber optic microscope, but the idea is that the ants are in there, and each ant experiences a certain flow of ants past it, a string of contact with other ants, and the pattern of this interaction determines whether the ant comes back out and what it does and when it comes back out. And so you can also see this in the ants just outside the nest entrance like this. Each ant then as it comes back in, is contacting the other ants, and the ants that are waiting just inside the nest to decide whether to go out on their next trip are contacting the ants coming in. So what's interesting about this system is that it's messy, it's variable, it's noisy, and in particular in two ways. The first is that the experience of the ants of each ant can't be very predictable, because the rate at which ants comes back depends on all little things that happen to an ant as it goes out and does its task outside. And the second thing is that an ant's ability to assess this pattern must be very crude, because no ants can do any sophisticated counting. So we do a lot of simulation and modeling and also experimental work to try to figure out how those two kinds of noise combine to in the aggregate produce the predictable behavior of ant colonies. Again, I don't want to say that this kind of haphazard pattern of interactions produces a factor that works with the precision and efficiencies of clockwork. In fact, if you watch ants at all, you end up trying to help them, because they never seem to be doing things exactly the way that you think they ought to be doing it. So it's not really that out of this haphazard contact perfection arises, but it works pretty well. Ants has been around for several hundred million years. They cover the earth except for Antarctica. Something that they're doing is clearly successful enough that this pattern of haphazard contacts in the aggregate produce something that allows ants to make a lot more ants. And one of the things that we're studying is how natural selection might be acting now to shape this use of interaction patterns. These networks of interaction patterns to perhaps increase the foraging efficiency of ant colonies. So the one thing though that I want you to remember about this is that these patterns of interactions are something that you expect to be closely connected to colony size. The simplest idea is that when an ant is in a small colony and an ant in a large colony can use the same rule, like I expect to meet another forager every 3 seconds, but in small colonies it's likely to meet fewer foragers just because there are fewer other foragers there to meet. So this is the kind of rule that as a colony develops and gets older and larger, will produce different behavior in an old colony and a small young one. Thank you. Applause. And this is the end of my speech. Thank you.